later. 12 seconds later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
2 very boring minutes later. A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 5 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
Many minutes later. 1 hour later.
2 hours later.
3 hours later. 5 hours later. 346 minutes later.
6 hours later.
6.5 hours later. 7 hours later.
8 hours later.
Approximately 10 hours later. Many hours later. Many unbearable hours later.
Tomorrow.
48 hours later. 2 days later.
72 hours later. Several days later.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 1 week later. 2 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later.
Many months later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
1 eternity later.